Okay, welcome to part 3 of the Get Better Results Through Better Conversations webinar series. So in this webinar, we're going to examine 4 conversation wrecking mistakes to avoid and 6 best of tips for the during and after moments of truth. So in parts 1 and 2, we talked about before the conversation, how to begin the conversation, and now we're doing during and after. So let's talk about the mistakes to avoid when you're actually having the conversation. And again, what I've tried to do with this series is pull out some of the most useful recommendations from the full day program and what will eventually be an online series. So number 1, mistake. When the person disagrees or isn't buying into what we're saying, dialing up our convince-o-meter. And what I mean by that is that natural human tendency to simply try to be more influential by adding more power to what we're saying, whether it's through voice tone or through word choice. And when you think about your own experience, when somebody does that with you, and they try to be more forceful, typically what happens is you become more resistant to their message. So think for a moment of some of the conversations where you were trying to influence the other person to see something from your perspective and how you amped up or dialed up your intensity level and the result that that got you. So, common mistake that most of us make. I still catch myself making this mistake. Number 2 is when we see the other person getting defensive or angry, not addressing the fact that they're getting defensive or angry, but instead plowing ahead with the topic we want to talk about. And I think this is one of the biggest and most common mistakes that we make because it's uncomfortable addressing negative emotions. And it's almost like we hope that if we ignore the fact that the person is getting defensive or angry, they might not notice it and it'll go away, when obviously the opposite happens. And you just think about your own experience where if neither you nor the other person talks about the fact that you and or the other person are getting upset, but just talks about whatever the issue is, how the tension continues to rise. And so in the tips part of this webinar of the during the conversation moment of truth, we'll talk about what to do instead of ignoring the emotional dynamic that's going on and plowing ahead. Okay, so moving away from mistakes to avoid, let's talk about the tips. Talk about what to do during the conversation moment of truth. So if the person is disagreeing with our point of view or they're not buying into what we're saying, rather than dial up our convince-o-meter, what we want to do is pause, take a deep breath, and then paraphrase back to the other person our understanding of what they're saying, and then ask if we've got it right. So, for instance, I might say, Sarah, I want to make sure that I'm getting at what you're saying. Is what you're saying blah, 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 blah? So that would be the paraphrase. Is that what you're saying? Am I getting you right? So just as simple as that. Is that what you're saying, or am I getting that right? And you think about what this accomplishes. So when we do what's natural for most of us, the try to convince them, try to amp up our intensity, it only makes them dig into their position more firmly. But when we show goodwill, when we show our sincere desire to understand their point of view, and we do that by paraphrasing what they're saying and then asking if we've got it right, when we communicate that goodwill and desire, it helps them shift into a more receptive state. It also, very importantly, shifts us into a more receptive state. And this has been an interesting byproduct for me in using this simple language pattern over the years, is that I find that I now use that when I find myself becoming more agitated or more intense in my trying to convince the other person. So now when I notice that, I will consciously stop, take a deep breath, and then paraphrase. And I find that not only does it calm me down, it shifts me into that more receptive frame of mind. And you probably notice the pause and the deep breath piece and how that directly shifts our physiology, because slow deep breathing triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of the nervous system that triggers the relaxation response. And because the quality of our interactions is profoundly affected by our emotional state, our ability to think clearly and intuitively directly affected by our emotional state. Doing the deep breathing, or just taking one deep cleansing breath, as sometimes they're said, is said, will help us shift immediately our emotional state. So that's one approach. And then the second approach is to pause, take the deep breath, and then ask them to paraphrase what we've said. So it might go something like this: Hank, I want to make sure that I'm communicating clearly what I'm trying to communicate. Can you let me know what you hear me saying, or what you've heard me say? Or can you let me know your understanding of what I'm trying to say? So you notice the way I phrase it. It's not about whether the other person was paying attention, or are they smart enough to know what I'm saying. It's putting the onus on me. Am I being clear? And that helps make it not come across as you're quizzing them or come across as patronizing. And I actually had a wonderful bit of feedback just recently from a workshop participant. I was doing a two-part program on this material, and she mentioned how after the first seminar, she got a chance to use this particular technique with her husband, and where they had an argument that typically would escalate, she asked him to paraphrase back his understanding of what she was saying, and it turned out what he was hearing was very different from what he was saying. And she said how wonderful it was to be able to have that intervention, and then to be able to clarify, like, oh no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, and how instead of having the typical, oh, here we go again, conflict, they were able to get back on track and have a productive conversation. So rather than dialing up our convince-o-meter, trying to be even more influential, to do these two techniques. Now, related to these techniques are when you see the other person is getting upset, when they're getting defensive or they're becoming more aggressive. So rather than pretending that's not happening and hoping their emotional state will go away if you just ignore it, rather than doing that, one technique is to name the game. So an example would be, I get the feeling that what I'm saying is really irritating you. So you're putting words to the dynamic that's going on in the moment. Or you could ask about what's going on. I can see what I'm saying is bugging you. Can you tell me why? So two really simple techniques or language patterns that help break that rigid, the plane is going down in flames trajectory that happens when we keep slogging away trying to talk about the topic. You know, one thing that's sort of interesting about the name the game phenomenon is research showing that when people name the feelings that they're having, that process literally cools down the brain structure called the amygdala, which plays a major role in negative emotional states and aggression. So putting words to emotions helps a person work through those emotions. So a couple thoughts about making sure that when we ask about what's going on works well is it must be in a sincere tone of voice. So we can't say, I can see what I'm saying is really bugging you, or sound like we're trying to be their therapist in this sort of sanctimonious or patronizing tone of voice. So I'll see if I can imitate that. So I can see what I'm saying is bugging you. Can you tell me why? So you get the idea. All right. It also needs to be devoid of challenge or antagonism. So this, again, why voice tone is so important. So those are what not to do's and a couple of tips for during the conversation. Let's go to the fourth and final moment of truth. What about after the conversation? So, mistakes to avoid. Having our game plan be, I hope I never have to talk about this again. And if you're like most of us, that's been our that's been our game plan at time, especially when the conversations are deeply personal in our personal life, or very challenging in our personal life, as well as really difficult performance review types of conversations with somebody who's very antagonistic or defensive. If that's our game plan, we're destined to be in trouble. And related to that is just not setting up a follow-up plan, thinking that it's sort of, was it called one and done? Simply having the conversation will do the trick. Okay, so let's go from what not to do to what to do in the after moment of truth. So number one is set up a follow-up plan before you end the conversation. So technically this is still in the during the conversation, but it speaks to a tip for the after moment of truth is to have a follow-up plan. And so the time to discuss the follow-up plan is in the conversation. So make sure you have a follow-up plan. And actually, to be really technical, you want to design at least a rough outline of your follow-up plan before you have the conversation. So in the very first moment of truth, but that gets negotiated in the conversation. So if you want behavior change, and this is obviously I'm talking about when I talk about follow-up plan, those conversations that relate to behavior change, performance improvement, etc. Also, and again, technically, this would be at the end of the during the conversation moment of truth, but that information will help inform what you do after the conversation happens. So asking the person, so saying something like, I want to make sure that I do everything I can to help you be successful. What are things that I can be doing and maybe not be doing to be most helpful to you or be most useful to you? Number three, now we're officially in the after moment of truth, after the conversation, is to make sure you're catching the person doing things right. There's lots of research in the world of behavior modification, behavioral psychology, about the phenomenon of shaping behavior. And what that means is simple rewards like, hey, way to go, I really appreciate that you did such and such. So it doesn't have to be tangible rewards, it can just be appreciation, recognition. Simple rewards of incremental steps toward the desired goal shapes behavior toward that goal. In fact, there was a fun book titled something like What I Learned from Shamu about marriage, or something about Shamu in the title. So it's this lady who trained Shamu, and how what worked with a killer whale also works with spouses, kids, co-workers, etc. And so one of the things that she talked about is teaching Shamu a particular trick. She would throw him a fish whenever he did anything remotely close to the behavior like that more complex trick. All right, so catching person doing things right. What it also does, and this is really important, it helps build goodwill between you and the other person. It helps to make deposits in what I sometimes call the goodwill bank account between you and the other person. So especially if it's been a difficult conversation, the other person might harbor negative feelings. Even though you handled it well and you were justified, it's never pleasant to receive negative feedback or have difficult conversations. And so by catching the person doing things right, showing appreciation for their progress helps build goodwill and therefore strengthen the relationship. Ask for feedback on your feedback delivery. And this is a really important point because it communicates several things. Number one, it communicates we're two adults here. And actually, I even recommend doing this with your kids. I've done this as a parent. But let's stick with the workplace here. It communicates we're two adults here. And I think that's important because oftentimes, you think about it, if you've ever gotten criticism from your boss, negative feedback from your boss, if it can feel like you're a little kid again. And by asking for feedback from the person you gave feedback to, it helps balance the power differential some. It also communicates that you care about your effect on them, which has a huge impact on the relationship and has a huge impact on whether they care about pleasing you. You think about that. You're more earnest about doing a great job for a boss who truly cares about you than one who acts like because they're in a position of power, they get to act any way they want and you just need to learn how to deal with it. So asking for feedback on your feedback delivery. So it might go something like this. Hey, Sam, I'd like to follow up on our conversation yesterday. And since, now we've had about 24 hours between time and we've both kind of thought about it, I'm curious if you have any feedback for me about how it went and if there's anything that I did that made it especially useful or helpful, and if there's anything that I did that I could do differently to make it either easier to hear the feedback or the feedback more useful. So you notice it's very conversational. It's not making it into a big deal. You can also just say, Sam, just as my responsibility to you and our organization is to bring out the best in you, and that's why we had the meeting yesterday about how to upgrade your performance and blah 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 this area. Also, my responsibility to me and to our organization is to make sure that I'm doing the best I can and bring out the best in my team. And so I'd really appreciate some feedback from you about our feedback session yesterday in terms of things that I might have done that were useful, things that I might do differently in the future to make it more useful. So you get how I'm doing that. So that second example that I just gave you, uh, put some context behind why you're asking for feedback. Okay, so those were 4 tips for the after moment of truth. So we're winding up now. So to recap, we're going to do a brief recap of the video series. So we did the before moment of truth. Remember, don't wing it. Don't spend your time working yourself up into self-righteous outrage in a negative emotional state. Do learn how to shift from furious to curious. And so simply asking the question, what would be the best way to bring this up to increase the odds the conversation will go well? That simple question is one of a number of ways that can shift us into the curious mode. And when we're curious, it's really hard to be furious. Do get an alternative perspective. That tip alone is worth its weight in gold. So rather than stay stuck in our own tormented little world, creating stories about why the other person did what they did and having arguments in our head with them, come up with our game plan, how we're going to bring it up, and then get feedback from a trusted friend or colleague, both about our perspective on the situation and to get their perspective on how we're thinking of bringing it up. In the beginning moment of truth, don't go in if you still have an emotional charge. So that's where I say, I have to get this off my chest is not a reason to have the conversation. Don't allow your voice to have an edge to it. I'm really kind of wondering, guys, you hear that edge. And as I might have mentioned in the earlier webinar, I can't remember if I included this, the part of the brain that processes emotion, the limbic system, is also the part of the brain that processes voice tone. And that's why voice tone is such a powerful elicitor of emotional state. And that's why it's so important to make sure we have at least a neutral voice tone and preferably a positive, kindly, compassionate, encouraging, inviting voice tone. Don't start off with judgment, accusation, or some other aggressive approach that will obviously immediately trigger a similar response in the other person. So we don't want that. So that's where getting the feedback from another person is really helpful. Do name the game. So if it's an ongoing issue, like a person not meeting their commitments or person getting defensive when you try to give them feedback, address that ongoing pattern rather than simply addressing yet another instance of that pattern. And do express your positive intent. So do you remember that? So you might say, Jane, obviously I want to do the best I can as your manager and bring out the best in you. And so part of that is both to point out things that are right on track and then things that I think need to be improved on. And so the need to be improved on piece that I want to talk about today, blah, blah, blah. Or the example that I gave in the earlier webinar where I was coaching that clinical nurse leader about how to communicate that she was giving this feedback not because it meant the person was in trouble, but her intention was for it to be a good thing to prevent any type of injury to herself or the patients. So even if it seems obvious to you what your positive intent is, putting it out on the table is really helpful. So during the conversation moment of truth, remember we talked about don't dial up your convince-o-meter. If the other person is getting defensive, don't ignore it, address it. Remember we did the pause, take a deep breath, paraphrase, or pause, take a deep breath, ask them to paraphrase back to you. We just talked about that in this webinar. Remember, we also talked about the name the game if the person is getting upset and ask them what's going on. And then last but not least, remember, I hope I never have to talk about this, is the game plan. Don't be sloppy about a follow-up plan, so don't wing it. Do set up a follow-up plan. Do ask how you can help, and do catch the person doing things right. And then last but not least, do ask for feedback on your feedback. Now, to dive deeper, if you go to BRTBC, Better Results through betterconversations.com, you'll get information about getting more intensive training on topic. And also, if you're not local and you want to go into more depth, you can email me to learn more about the Get Better Results Through Better Conversations program, either for yourself, I'll be putting together an online program, as well as if you want to talk about bringing this on site, whether virtually or live and in person with your management team. Also, if you're interested in a complimentary Get Better Results Through Better Conversations laser coaching session, you can email me. And what that would be a 30 to 45-minute, very focused session that helps you get clear on what your vision is and the basics of how to get started on having that conversation. And what I found over the years in working with people is just getting clear on the vision of what it is that they want is sort of like that saying, a problem defined is a problem half solved. That alone makes a huge difference in your ability to have a productive conversation. Okay, and last but not least, that question that I asked you in the beginning of the webinar series. What difference would it make in your life and in the results you want if you got really good at having these conversations? So I want to actually bring you back to the beginning and to think about what are the results that you are looking for. What are those better results that motivated you to watch this webinar series? And just think about, what would it be like to get those results? And what would it be like to feel more confident about having those important conversations? And you feel more confident because you have the skills to bring up those important issues in a way that the other person can hear and also help facilitate the conversation. So I want us to end off this webinar with you thinking about that. And the reason why I want you to think about what would it be like and how would it feel is because getting good at this really takes a lot of work. I've been teaching this for years, and I still find it's an ongoing, never-ending process. And that's one of the reasons why I love teaching it, because it reminds me of the various techniques and language patterns that are so helpful. And also, because each situation is different, each time you have one of these conversations, it obviously sharpens your skills and helps you become more adaptable and flexible in your response to all different kinds of conversations. So it takes a lot of work, and the only reason why you'll do this work is if you're really clear about both the price that you're paying right now for not getting the results you want and not having these conversations, and also feel what it would feel like to get the results you want and to have those conversations. So as we close up here, I want to ask you to, when you end off this webinar, to spend some more time thinking about this question. And then if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, david@humannatureatwork.com, and hope to either see you at a live event or have you online in future programs. So thanks so much for being part of this series, and hope to see you in the future. Take care. Bye.